Welcome back to A Time to Think. Pastor Chris pastors a church in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. My name is Pastor Josh. I'm in Wausau, Wisconsin. Chris, we started this podcast, A Time to Think, because we recognized that there were some really pressing issues, cultural shifts that week in and week out you and I were talking about. We're talking with our friend Justin Nowitzki, but we weren't really able to engage with in any depth from the pulpit.
Right.
Mostly because preaching on a Sunday is heralding a truth.
Mm-hmm.
We're announcing the kingdom. We're announcing that God has come, God has saved, God will redeem. It doesn't really lend itself to teasing out different philosophies or teasing out different things. And so we set aside this time to think.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, 2 months in, the Dobbs decision in the past few weeks has been just an incredible opportunity for us to put into practice the fact that we need spaces to think. So in a previous episode of our podcast, we have talked through some broader scale issues. If you haven't listened to that one yet, I would encourage you to listen to it just because some of the things we set foundationally in that episode, we're going to maybe assume in this episode. For instance, we ended that last episode talking about a religious position and a non-religious position for human life beginning at conception. We're probably going to go back to that multiple times here. So I would encourage you, if you haven't listened to that one yet, pause here, hop back to the last episode, and then come and join us. Because, Chris, what we're doing here in the next few minutes, I have 5 questions/responses that I have encountered on social media, people that are passionately against the pro-life movement, who are angry, who are in despair over the fact that Roe versus Wade is no longer law of the land. These are the responses I'm seeing. We want to set aside a time to think about these different responses, how Christians should respond to these. One of the ones that are most common, Chris, is the government cannot tell a woman what to do with her body. Okay? Before we get into this, I'll reiterate something we said in the last episode. Language really matters, and we live in a culture of short, snappy statements. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes those short, snappy statements, we think, that seems right. Someone says, the government, the boogeyman,
the man,
cannot tell a woman what to do with her body. And there's a part of me that goes, agreed, right? But if we step back and we say, okay, how is this being used? What do you mean by what to do with your body? These types of things. That's where we start to understand this short, snappy statement actually means something much broader.
Correct.
So I guess, first of all, Chris, when someone says the government cannot tell a woman what to do with her body, what do they mean?
Man, that's a good question. It's a good question because I think it if we take and really this has roots probably 100 years deep when we go back to the early 1900s and women's suffrage and the pursuit of the right to vote for women, which is a good thing, right?
Just as we're if we had like a little ding, we are pro the right to vote.
Pro women's suffrage, yes. So please vote if you're a woman. But when it comes to looking at the roots of where this comes from, the initial for women's suffrage was women are people too, and there was what I would say is an injustice done to the personhood of a woman. Mm-hmm. That was corrected by women's suffrage. Mm-hmm. Now, that's key to understand because one of the pro-life organizations that's prominent is the Susan B. Anthony Foundation. Mm-hmm. Now, Susan B. Anthony was a proponent of the women's right to vote movement and also pro-life, right? So I think these things are compatible because when somebody says the government shouldn't tell a woman what to do, I think there are roots in the whole, treat women equally as men, and that men and women should have equal rights in the eyes of the law. 100% agree. 100%. We totally agree with that. But where that starts to take a little bit different skew from where pro-life, pro-choice perspectives are is when Margaret Sanger pursued the development of Planned Parenthood. And Margaret Sanger's position was one that would be what, from a pro-life perspective, would consider a radical position pertaining to women's rights to do with their body as they please, because it became so flattened, the idea of equal rights between men and women, that it didn't take into account the fact that women have this very unique and quite frankly miraculous component of their body to carry and nurture life as it's developing. Right. And so as Margaret Sanger came on the scene, the whole idea of don't tell me as a woman what to do with my body diminished the fact that men and women have different constructions, and men don't have the privilege and the honor of carrying life before birth.
Yeah, and since language matters, you just said something really interesting. I don't know that I've heard it phrased that way. Men do not have the privilege and the honor of carrying life. That's a very specific construction of a statement, rather than men have the freedom to not be pregnant.
Right. Yeah.
And so we're talking about different ideologies and what we would call the telos of things, the purpose of things. And so some of these arguments are based in the purpose of humanity is career progression, individual liberty, those types of things. And look at those men that get career progression and individual liberty, and the way to have equality for women is to make sure nothing stands in the way of the ability to do exactly what the man does when you're observing correctly, and the Bible observes specifically that men and women are uniquely created in different ways.
Correct.
That just as men have different statures in order for their bodies to be used in different ways, women have different body composition so that they can do different things.
Which from a Christian perspective, we look at and see as a beautiful thing.
It's good.
And so to be able to just kind of maybe you are watching this and thinking those Christian men talking about this from their privileged perspective of they don't have to. Let me just say that we see, and this is one of the most historically compelling reasons for Christianity in the early church socially, was that women were viewed with integrity and worth and value and dignity in a way that very few other religious systems had ever even considered. And so to just say that...
It takes a quick glance across the globe to see that cultures that value women are steeped in Judaism or Christianity.
Right.
It just a very quick observation.
Yes.
So what has happened, Chris, is this is a whole other podcast episode. But what has happened is American culture was steeped in the Christian view of women, which leads to the idea of something like women's suffrage, because women are valuable, uniquely, or they are made in the image of God, just as men are.
Equally, yeah.
But then the culture divorces the view and dignity of women from a religious position and just keeps going.
Correct.
And so it's like Christianity was this nice thing to get us here. Let's discard it and keep going. Let's pull back to the idea that the government cannot the government cannot make laws dictating what women can do with their bodies. There's a couple fundamental flaws with this, Chris. One, as we discussed at the end of the last episode, is that we all intuitively know that a child in the womb is a different body. And we know that, just one minor example, is the fact that when my wife was pregnant, no one said, "Look at that four-legged woman."
That would have been very offensive to me.
There's a lot of offensive things you can do to a pregnant woman, but no one actually does that, right? And so no one said, "How does it feel to be a woman that has two beating hearts?" We all intuitively know that though there is an undeniable attachment and an inhabitation of the child in the womb, it's a different person. My wife's body composition, as far as how many organs she had, how many limbs she had, it didn't change. How many brains that she had didn't change. So we know that that's a different body, and when we get to that point, we say, well, the government tells us a lot of things about what not to do to other bodies. Right? You are not allowed to murder another body. You are not allowed to sexually assault another body. You are not allowed to even steal from another body.
And even taking it one step back to a topic that mental health is talked about pretty regularly for good reason, but what will happen if a law enforcement officer hears somebody talking about taking their own life? They're taken into custody. Right? The government steps in and says, if you are going to harm yourself, we will literally keep you in a hospital, in an institution, until we have determined that you are no longer a threat to yourself. So, I mean, let's be clear here. The same people who want to advocate for this idea of don't tell me what to do with my body, don't tell me what to do with my body, they may indeed call the authorities if they find out a friend of theirs is having suicidal thoughts and saying, would you please go do a welfare check on this person and keep them from doing something to harm themselves.
So really the argument is, don't tell me which things to do with my body.
Correct.
Because we all agree there's some things that
Yes.
I can't do. And if you're asking which things you can and cannot do, now we're in a moral, ethical, religious conversation. So I think very quickly the idea that the government cannot tell women what to do with their bodies, I think a pretty dramatic retort to that is, well, the government can't tell men what to do with their bodies unless that man is trying to sexually assault another body. And then the government very well should tell that man what not to do with his body, right? So when our body is infringing on another body, the government tells us to stop. Therefore, the entire argument there is the fetus a body? And we would say yes.
Yeah, and traditionally when we look at the history of government, at least the governmental systems in which we operate and function in the West, we have traditionally understood for the past 300 years that the primary interest of the government is the protection of those under its care, right? And so that's one of the reasons people say things like we should provide health care for people, is because the government exists, and I would say for the common defense of people from threats, both
You have
domestic.
me singing Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah, there you go.
The preamble. Provide for the common defense.
Yes. And that's really what the government exists to do. Fundamentally, if you strip everything else back, every program, everything else, parks, whatever out of the picture, you say the government exists to protect those under its care. And we I think, can confidently say that that means the most vulnerable are the ones the government needs to be most concerned with. And from a pro-life perspective, and from what I believe is a pretty clear biological perspective, people who are mentally disabled, the elderly and infirmed, those who are incapacitated mentally, those who cannot fend for themselves, the government has the greatest interest to ensure they are protected from harm. And in the case of a child and a mother who are intertwined in the child being in the womb like that, we would say the government has such a significant interest in making sure that child cannot defend itself from the actions of another person, including its own mother, needs to be protected.
Yeah. Before we get to pro-choice argument number 2, one thing I wanted to mention at the outset is we are having a dialogue here. Now, you and I generally tend to agree on a lot of things, so our dialogue is not super combative quite often, but we do believe in the value of setting aside time to talk, which I guess I would encourage anyone listening, if you're hearing things that are confusing or disagreeable to you, my email is pastorjosh@downtownmissionchurch.com, pastorchris@downtownmissionchurch.com for his email, or if you're in our church already, you likely have our phone number or a way to message us otherwise, because we believe that goodness comes through this dialogue of seeking the scriptural truth, seeking the rational truth. And so I would just invite you, if this is a hard conversation, this may be one that you've never really ventured into because it's volatile with your family or your workplace or whatever it may be, that we want to engage in these types of conversations. So the next one, we've talked about government not telling women what to do, and the next response is keep religion out of government, right? We used the term in our last episode, a theocracy, where the religious law dictates all the other laws. Yeah. So, Chris, we should keep religion out of government. Why?
There's a few podcasts right there, Josh.
Let's take the most serious care of this example and say, Christians shouldn't be able to tell other people what to do because of their religious beliefs. What say you?
I agree.
Well then, how can you agree with that and also celebrate the overturn of Roe?
Yeah. So we go back in the history of our country, and we are talking from a uniquely American perspective here because that's where we live, right? So this is what's relevant. This conversation would not be had over in Iran right now. It's not a conversation to be had in China right now. It's fundamentally
good point.
different framework. So we're talking from a legal perspective right now that we operate within. Now, if somebody wants a different legal perspective, someone has a different governmental perspective, then they can live in that country and have that conversation with those in their government. But if you are an American, we have to function within our legal tradition, our legal system, our political and governmental history. All of this plays into these types of discussions. So when it comes to religion in government, to be very clear here, when a democracy functions, a constitutional republic functions, one of the benefits, and I think one of the unique benefits, is that it calls for public input, right? So it calls for public input. I am an advocate for free speech, okay? And here's how we'll kind of put this in terms that can bring maybe another topic to bear on this one and understand why a Christian can have deep religious convictions over this and yet not be a theocrat, right?
Okay.
So with the issue of free speech, I deeply value freedom of speech, not just mine, right? So I value freedom of speech because there is a goodness in the ability to dialogue and have conversation, and from a Christian perspective, the gospel message itself doesn't depend necessarily, but flourishes in an environment where freedom of speech is cherished and championed, right? So the ability to actually have a conversation with somebody with competing views, competing perspectives is valuable. And quite frankly, whether or not somebody chooses to believe this does not change the fact that even though many of the founders of this nation, who were official founders, as it were, held to what we would call deist views, those deist views were, in a strange way.
Think about the clockmaker analogy.
Yes.
Is always the easiest
Yes.
one. Someone makes a watch, they make a watch, and then they get away from the watch, and the watch just runs.
Yeah.
So the Christian position is God makes the world and is still in the
Involved with
world
it,
and,
right.
and is orchestrating the world and is intimate with the
Yeah.
world. The deist strategy is, sure, God made the world, but he's pretty much
stepped
stepped
back,
back.
right.
It's running properly.
Right. And so a lot of the early founders of this nation held a deistic perspective, but in a funny way, if you read through some of the documents, it was a Christian deistic perspective. It was not a Taoist deistic perspective. It was not a Buddhist.
Yeah, why write a constitution if nothing matters?
Right. Right. Yes, there you go.
The First Amendment is nothing matters.
Nothing matters.
End of Taoism.
Yes, exactly. It's a Metallica. Nothing else matters. But when you look at these documents, you look at what is the legal tradition of our nation founded upon, it values value. Okay, it values values. It is not, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think this is where a fundamental misunderstanding exists for people now because of what we've talked about in prior weeks about the cult of self and the idea that we can choose to be whatever we want to be, and that the most valuable thing about us is that we can be whatever we want to be. Is that what's been evacuated out of this conversation, the idea of morality and ethics. And morality and ethics, everybody holds morality and ethics. Yeah. Everybody does. And I think that's probably one of the most sinister things about debates that people may have.
For instance, when a court case gets overturned and someone says, you can't take away the rights of another person, that's not a scientific claim.
Right.
That is a philosophical, ethical claim.
Yes. Yes.
People have rights.
Yes.
People should be able to keep their rights. Other people shouldn't be able to take their rights. All of those are ethical, moral, philosophical claims. And I have a pretty broad definition of religious, and so I would define them as religious claims.
Correct.
Which is, I think, important here. Let me give you two different definitions of religion. One of which I would say should effectively, I don't know, stay out of the government, but should not dictate government. The other is always a part of government because humans are a part of government. The first one is organized religion. Okay, so I would agree with the statement that Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, even something like secular humanism, that's a religious position, even though it doesn't involve a god. I would agree in principle that none of those religious systems should be able to dictate law. As
it should be enshrined as you must be beholden to this religious perspective.
Right. So the law of the land should not come from, to a T, a religious text. I would agree with that. And in that case, we're talking about an organized religion. Clearly, you and I are favorable towards one organized religion. We like organization. We think it's helpful.
Yes.
So that's one definition. The second definition of religion or religious is a collection of views about humanity, about origins, about destiny.
Yep.
Now, actually, 2 years ago, Chris, when we started the idea of a podcast, this was our first series of episodes. It was titled "Everyone Has a Religious Worldview,"
Yeah.
and what it boils down to is everyone answers questions like, "How did we get here? Where are we going? What went wrong? Who's going to fix it?"
Yeah.
All of those questions are religious questions.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you believe we got here through Big Bang and evolution, or through deism, or through the creation in 6 days, what went wrong? Whether you believe anything's gone wrong. That's not a scientific statement. That's a
Right.
religious statement. If you believe that human sin is the problem, that's a religious statement. And and then maybe purpose is a big one too. Where are we going? What is our destiny? Is our purpose to find happiness? Is our purpose to glorify God? Is our purpose to go along to get along? Is our purpose to, as Freud would say, avoid pain and pursue pleasure? Now, any elected official, whether they are an evangelical Christian, whether they are the type of person who uses the Bible in their stump speeches but doesn't really believe in the Bible, whether they are aggressively atheistic or even what I like to call the nice atheist, the atheist that you meet and you're like, man, you're really nice. I just want you to be a Christian. I like you.
Sure.
All of those people are going to make laws based on origin, problem, and purpose. They're going to say, the problem with our country, it's not human sin that's the problem, it's systemic injustice. Okay, that's what's the problem. Or they're going to make laws based on purpose. Libertarians are going to make laws based on the fact that they don't think the government should meddle in people's private decisions. Maybe there's some existentialism in there. People should be able to choose.
Right.
These are all going to be decisions made from commitments that are non-scientific. They're commitments about origin, purpose, problem. And so in that way, the Christian and the non-Christian are both voting based on things that are religious in nature. To bring it back to the abortion conversation, if someone says you cannot take away a woman's rights, the question is, well, why not?
And who gave those rights? How are they rights? Why are they rights?
Because from an evolutionary theory, I sure can.
Right.
If I'm stronger.
Correct.
If the course of creation, if the origin is strong outlasts the weak, and I'm stronger, then why can't I take away rights?
And what's sad, particularly pertaining to the abortion discussion, we brought up Margaret Sanger previously, and Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. And sadly and awfully, in the early 20th century, it was in vogue to be a eugenicist. And another individual came about who popularized eugenics in a country named Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler basically said, we need to look at those in the society who are weak, deformed, those who can't contribute, those who are a drain, and we need to eliminate those. Margaret Sanger had the exact same statements. However, for her, really evilly, it had to do with race, and it had to do with poverty status, and it had to do with the unborn.
And if we are to respond, and we should respond by saying that is evil,
Correct.
Like taking the life of an unborn child because they're the wrong gender or race is evil and heinous. The only way to have any foundation for that is to have some sort of religious position. To say that all races are made in the image of God, or both genders made in the image of God. Short of a religious position about the origin of humanity, you cannot adequately say that there's any dignity in a woman or an unborn child. It's all about power structures. And so I want to end by saying I firmly believe that all races made in the image of God, both genders made in the image of God. But if anyone is even saying women have the right to have rights, that's a religious statement in nature. And so to pull back to the original question, no one in that way can keep religion out of government.
I mean, it's basically everybody's a theocrat at that point, or nobody's a theocrat, but we can't level that accusation against somebody while reserving the rights for some to make ethical statements simply because they are not part of an organized religious system.
Right. Let's get going here with a couple more. We'll take these more quickly. One that I've seen a ton is this: you're only pro-birth, not pro-life. You're only pro-birth, not pro-life. Quick statement from me. I think that what that is doing is taking an understandable phrase, pro-life, that everyone understands what it means.
Yeah.
Everyone understands that historically pro-life has been the name for a movement that has sought to end abortion. Everyone gets that.
Yeah.
And what it is sought to do is now broaden that definition to accuse people of not fulfilling their own strategy.
Yeah.
When I've never met a pro-lifer that has included universal health care in their fight. So whatever you want to call a pro-lifer, no one's ever saying, we believe this is actually about universal health care, we're just putting it off to the side. Give whatever name you want to the movement, but the movement has been very descriptively about abortion and ending abortion, not anything else.
Yeah.
So when you say like you're only pro-birth, you're not pro-life, I think the pro-lifer might say, okay, if that's what you want to call me, like, because yes, that is what I am concerned with, is the birth of the child who's conceived.
Yeah.
Any additions there?
Yeah, I would take this, and I do think, to be perfectly honest, and I think if somebody takes a hard look at it, there are many parallels between the abolition of slavery and the abolition of abortion as a permitted practice in our culture. A lot of similar sentiments are shared, and I'm just gonna, if maybe you're watching this and you are contemplating or hold to a position that says abortion is a good thing, just going to encourage you to consider the fact that 150 years ago, there were plenty of people who said slavery is a good thing and had a lot of reasons behind that. When it comes to this issue of how abortion fits in with slavery, can you remind me the initial question one more time,
You're
please?
only pro-birth.
Yes.
You're not pro-life.
Yes. So the argument could have been made during the abolition movement. You're only anti-enslavement. You're not pro-life. Right? An argument could have been made saying, you only care about abolishing slavery. What are you going to do with all the slaves once they're gone? And this was an argument used by Southern slaveholders. Southern slaveholders would literally say this: if we let these slaves go, I mean, we provide for them right now. They're on our plantations, and we have a place for them to live, and we have food for them to eat. They're slaves, right? But look at, they have it, okay, right? What's going to happen to them if they go off on their own? How are they going to be able to fend for themselves? How are they going to be able to get their own land and modes of transportation? It's okay here, right? And so they literally made the argument, you're just anti-slavery, but you're not really pro-slave like we are, because we're pro-slave. And I would say there's an issue that supersedes every other issue. And in the case of abortion, you can have discussions about universal health care independent of abortion.
Independent issues.
Yes, they're independent issues. Now, I'll say for my part, and maybe this will rub some people the wrong way.
Actually, this is one of my favorite positions that you hold.
Yes.
Because I just like the fact that you go ahead and say it, and then I'll explain.
So I'll say it. I am a conservative guy. I mean, history of the Republican Party, that's all, yeah.
He's wearing an American
I'm wearing an
flag.
American,
So
yeah, exactly.
If you didn't need proof.
Yes, exactly. As somebody who looks at the purpose of government being for the common defense and the welfare of the people, I think that there is a case to be made from a conservative perspective about how we spend our country's resources and tax dollars to contemplate universal health care. I do think there's a case to be made.
You want to go farther than that.
Yeah, well,
you just don't want to get lambasted. Would you say you're pro-universal health care?
To an
extent?
I would say yes. I would say I'm pro-universal health care.
Yeah, but that's a separate...
It's a separate issue.
I think that's where this becomes really important, Chris, because, and this is the conversation I had with my wife a lot of the responses from the pro-choice side seek to maybe add burdens onto the pro-lifer or make personal attacks against the pro-lifer or change the conversation. So if someone says you're only pro-birth, you're not pro-life, I think you can start by saying, well, we're talking about birth right now. So we're actually talking about, does life begin at conception? And should a life that begins at conception be able to naturally progress towards birth? We believe yes.
Yes.
that's an isolated individual conversation. Now, what we do with universal health care, what we do with um, welfare programs, what we do with different types of things, we can have arguments about, is that the church's job or the government's
Right.
job? We can have those arguments, but they are actually in a different sphere.
Correct.
And so what we want to do as thinking people is just say, you can't take an argument from this sphere and negate this argument.
Correct.
Because we haven't even finished this argument yet.
Correct.
And so I think that's something we need to honestly look for. And I would say, if I was having the chance to talk to someone who's pro-choice, just to say, listen for the arguments of that side and ask, are they really about conception and human life, or are most of them seeking to remove the conversation from conception and human life? It seems like most of the pro-choice arguments that I've seen are more about trying to attack the inconsistency of a pro-life person, or the fear of what could happen to other rights of women, and so they're not always unimportant things, but often tangential things that take the conversation away from, does a human life start at conception?
Because what happens when you do encounter a pro-life individual who is pro-universal health care? What do you do at that point?
Yeah.
Right?
Or it's like, so people will say, well, if you're going to make the woman carry the baby to term, then fathers should be responsible in this way, shape, or form. And Christians are
Absolutely.
like, can we theoretically put that one
put that into law.
'Cause-
Exactly.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's where you're right. Number 4. This is actually maybe one that speaks to the fact that we're two dudes talking about this. We don't have a woman on, right? A lot of arguments are based on intersectionality, so who can speak with power in this discussion, and we're just two men talking about
That's
it.
correct.
So Chris, if you're opposed to abortion, then don't have one. Or
It's
maybe
a terrible argument to make.
Maybe in addition to that would be, men in white robes shouldn't be able to tell.
Right.
So there's an argument here about either just don't do it, or men can't speak to it.
Yeah, you don't have the right to speak into it. I think that's absolutely foolish, and I guess I'll say that right off the bat. I think it's absolutely foolish, because there are plenty of issues that are spoken into and dealt with illegally by people who have no vested interest in that. There are plenty of non-pet owners who can make policy about animal abuse, right? There are plenty of people, even people who have a pro-choice perspective, who have no children themselves, but are against child molestation and the abandonment of children. Like, just because you don't have a personal vested interest doesn't mean you can't speak to the appropriateness of a particular action.
We're actually going to get to this in, I think, our next episode of the podcast that has to do with Carl Trueman's book. Morality is not just my inner belief about what I find to be distasteful, or so it doesn't just say, well, Josh as a pet owner finds pet abuse distasteful.
Yeah.
It's Josh believes that because God has given man dominion over animals, which is external, objective morality and truth, because of that morality outside of Josh, he is now obligated to not abuse animals. And so you're right. It's not a subjective inner, like, I say the second thing, and I've said this in past podcasts, I think this is a really good litmus test. If you wouldn't say the same thing about racism, then don't say it about sexuality.
Yep.
So the argument is, if you're opposed to abortion, then don't have one. If you're opposed to slavery, then don't have one.
Right.
We would say that is an idiotic argument, because the real question is it moral to own another human being and abuse them?
Yeah.
No. So then no one should. And so once again, we're back to, does life start at conception? And I think it seems like a simple drum to beat, but I think we have to beat the drum over and over again, that the biggest primary question to decide here is, does life begin at conception?
Yeah.
Now, even if we believe, this is our last one before we end today, even if we believe life begins at conception, there are arguments made about what about rape, incest, or extreme poverty.
Yeah.
And these, I think, are some of, when I think about Christians, or because that's the sphere I run in is Christians. And when I think about people that are like, yeah, I believe that God knits together in the womb, but what about? This seems to be one of the harder ones to deal with. What about these extreme, painful circumstances, rape, incest, or extreme poverty? How do we deal with those, Chris?
Yeah, I think, another issue that's not on that list, but people talk about a threat to maternal health.
Okay, yeah. That's a good one.
I know one that's popularized now is the idea of ectopic pregnancies and how do you deal with an ectopic pregnancy. Just to that issue, because I do want to speak to that because that's really common right now is people talking about that. An ectopic pregnancy, nobody wins. Everybody dies. Like that's really legitimately how it works. It's not like in the way that it often is phrased, it's like somehow a pro-life person is seeing a woman's body as this incubator for this ectopic pregnancy to come to full term, for this child to live and the mother to just explode into a mess. And that's not even close to accurate. I mean, I'm experienced with pregnancies as a father of 6 children, and
Humble brag.
so I know how things work, how things operate, and nobody wins in an ectopic pregnancy. Everybody is injured by it, and so when it comes to the issue of what we would call a quote abortion in that situation, it is a terrible reality, but I would put that in the same place that I would put the idea of conjoined twins, right? So if you have conjoined twins and a prominent pro-life individual was actually one of the first to deal with this type of issue of fetal health, conjoined twins, those types of things was Dr. Ben Carson. And he dealt with these types of issues. These are ethical questions to be had, but at no point in this discussion should that diminish the personhood of, in that situation, yes, we're dealing with a child who is growing in such a way that both they and their mother will be injured and most likely die. And so it's an ethical question at that point pertaining to what you do on a medical level with that pregnancy and with that child, but it has nothing to do with whether or not you're declaring that a person. And so I think we take to these,
I think, Chris, just with the sensitivity of the moment here is, I want to be able to discern, is someone asking me this question because it's happened to them?
Right.
Because they're afraid of it happening to them? Or because they believe this is a gotcha?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I have a close personal friend who I believe the past couple of years dealt with an ectopic pregnancy, and I sat with him over breakfast and wept with him because it's painful.
Yeah.
Like no one, like you said, no one wins, which I think makes it all the more important that we don't use something like an ectopic pregnancy as a gotcha response.
Yep.
And I would put forth once again that we got to make sure when we're having these conversations, is something like rape, incest, poverty, or ectopic pregnancy used as a way to quickly win the argument, or because someone actually cares about it?
Right.
Because if I am using ectopic pregnancy as a way to win the argument, I don't care at all about the woman who's having one. And pastorally, you and I, we're concerned with 2 different spheres. One is the rational thinking sphere, and the other is the body that's sitting in our church, right?
Yeah.
And so I want to distinguish that here. Are we having a disembodied conversation about hypotheticals, or are we having a conversation that's very embodied?
Because I think in those cases, I mean, I can think of somebody that is very special to me, close to me, who was the product of a rape and conceived prior to Roe v. Wade, and this person's mother carried this baby to term, did not choose to kill her child as though somehow it was her child's fault. And, this person is very special and very important. And it's not like she is somehow a lesser individual because of the circumstances of her conception. Now, there's personal pain attached to that. And that's I think what we, the difference between gotcha and how do we care for people in the midst of that. But what it all ultimately comes back to is, does that change the nature and value of the person?
No.
Right? And so I can't look at this individual
just
and
like
say,
you and I would hold to a position that says any form of sex outside of marriage is unbiblical and therefore sinful. And yet we would never look at a person who
Conceived
was
out of wedlock.
conceived out
Yeah.
of wedlock and say lesser status.
Exactly.
Because we don't dictate the value of an individual. That same theology that says, Chris and Josh, every race, every development of a human being made in the image of God, valuable and worthy of protecting. The elderly, the infirm, the unborn, you have to value, you have to protect because they're made in my image by me. That same applies to someone that is made in an obscene circumstance.
Yeah.
Last thing I would say here, and that was a pretty heartfelt way to deal with some of these things. A slightly more statistical way, I think, definitely more statistical, slightly less passionate way is, if you look at the Guttmacher Institute, which is a self-described
Radically pro-abortion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think helpfully here is I'm going to a pro-abortion website for their own statistics. If you actually look at statistics of reported reasons why people have abortions, rape, incest, and extreme poverty are not, they're almost negligible statistics.
Sure.
So it's not even like they're not the majority. These numbers are from 2004. I think I have the numbers here. So they're a bit dated, but 2004, still some significant results. This is from the Guttmacher Institute. Among the structured survey respondents, the two most common reasons for having an abortion were, quote, having a baby would dramatically change my life, and, quote, I can't afford a baby. 74% of reasons cited dramatic life change, 73% cited I can't afford. So we want to talk in a second about what does afford mean. A large proportion of women, they continue, cited relationship problems or a desire to avoid single motherhood. So 50% of people are saying, I have a bad relationship or I don't want to be a single mother. Nearly 4 in 10 indicated they had completed their childbearing. Okay, so that's nothing about finances. It's just, I thought I was done. Okay, I decided I'm done and I don't want another. Almost 1/3 said they were not ready to have a child. Women also cited possible problems affecting the status of the fetus. Really only 10% of people cited potential health of the child. Okay, so a pretty low number. The most common secondary reason given was that a woman could not afford a baby because she was unmarried, 40%, or 38% it's going to interfere with education. Okay. Firstly, yes, dramatic life change, a baby does that. Take your money, a baby does that. Harder to raise a child as a single mother or in a relationship that is unhealthy, very much so. My wife has taken the summer off of her seminary courses because we have a 1-year-old. So it definitely affects education. So all of these they're true reasons: dramatic life change, change in finances.
Yeah.
The overwhelming statistics from a pro-abortion website show us that people are not primarily having abortions because of rape, incest, or extreme poverty. And the key phrase here is, I can't afford a baby now. That's so broad. Right. I mean, if you asked me, could you afford another baby right now? I'd probably say no. Right. But what that means is I've budgeted for one baby. Right. If we had a second, I might need to sell a car. Yeah. But I could, I could sell a car or get rid of cable, or I could do some things that would make me able to afford a baby. Yeah. All this is to say that a lot of times people will throw out extreme circumstances or what we might call fringe circumstances.
Outliers. Yeah.
Outliers. Chris, we never make moral claims and moral judgments based on outliers. Right. We make moral judgments and then we deal with the outliers, right? We don't go to the outlier, because if we always made moral judgments based on the outliers, we would have no moral judgments, which is honestly kind of where we're going.
Right.
So the point here for this last one is, I think it strikes at the gut and the heart of people to say, but what about the woman whose life is in danger? What about the woman who can't raise the kid in poverty? The pro-abortion website is telling us that's not the reason people are having abortions. And so let's make moral judgments based on the reason people are having them, and then let's deal with the outliers. Yeah. So we hope that we've been able to go through a few arguments. If you've encountered other pro-choice arguments that you're struggling with handling, or maybe you disagree with something we've said, we got email addresses. We said them earlier. And we'd love to engage with you. So thanks for taking some time to think.